name is Joe McCoy, and I'm an alcoholic.
Hi, Joe.
And you guys sure do pray fast. we pray a little slower down in Oklahoma. But it's good to be here, and I'm very, very happy to be here this weekend and meet a lot of old friends and to meet some new friends. And it's truly by the grace of God and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous and the program of Alcoholics Anonymous that I found in a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, and I'm sober today, and for that I'm very, very thankful. And I haven't had a drink since November the 3rd, 1973. In fact, I am very thankful. The only reason I mention that is because I'm bragging. Would you all do me all a favor? Let's stand up. If you see somebody next to you that you don't know, let's introduce ourselves and kind of get acquainted this weekend. It'd be a lot more fun all weekend if we do that.
My name's John.
You can turn loose of that girl now. Yeah. Thank you. I feel better already.
Charlie. Hi, everybody. My name's Charlie Parman. I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found in the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found necessary to take a drink for 8,283 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. It's great to be back in Red Deer. Great to be getting ready to talk about the thing we love to talk about the most, the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. And as we start these things, I always like to thank the committee, especially this guy named Gus, for the work that they've done to put this thing together. Thank them for inviting us to be here. Thank you guys for being here. This wouldn't be much of a big book study if you were not here. Joe and I would get tired of talking to each other pretty fast. Joe leaned across to me a while ago and he said, "Charlie, this is one of the best looking bunches of sick people I've seen in a hell of a long time. You guys really do look great." As we start one of these, we really do like to say that we do not consider ourselves to be the gurus of the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. We don't consider ourselves to be the experts on anything at all. We're just two old drunks that met together several years ago, found we have a mutual interest in the big book. We studied it together for quite some time, and hopefully we've learned a few things about it. And those few things we have learned, we just love to share with other people. We do not speak for AA as a whole. And you are most certainly free to agree or disagree with anything we say as you see fit. In fact, if we say something that can't be reconciled with what's in the big book, we suggest you don't pay any attention to that at all. We also are fully aware that the mind will absorb only about what the rear end will stand. Some of these sessions become quite long. For instance, tonight we probably won't take a break. If we do, it just makes it too late at night. But if you feel the need to get up and move around during one of these sessions, please feel free to do so. That's not going to bother us at all. My understanding is that the coffee will be out there continually. If you feel the need to go get a cup of coffee, please feel free to do that. That won't bother us at all. Or if you feel the need to go get rid of a cup of coffee, don't sit there and suffer in silence. Go right ahead. It won't bother us at all. The only thing wrong is everybody else will be watching you and they'll know where you're going, but that's all right, too. Everybody that knows me knows I love little stories and love little jokes. Everybody that knows me knows that I insist on having a good time everywhere I go. I believe in the big book when it says we are meant to be joyous, happy, and free. And we love to laugh, and we love to cut up, and we love to have fun, and we love to see other people laugh also. And if we can approach this weekend with the idea that maybe we'll learn something about our book, but also we'll have a good time while we're doing it, I think we're all in for a good, enjoyable, happy weekend. Those that know I love the stories, they usually slip things in the front of my big book. And when I get home from one of these sessions a day or two later, I always go look in it and I'm amazed at what I find sometimes. I'd like to share with you a little story that I found in the front of my book some months ago after doing one of these big book studies. And the story goes like this. It says, "Dear Abby." Now, I don't know whether you got an Abby up here or not, but we've got Abby in the States. It says, "Dear Abby, I'm a sailor in the Canadian Navy. And I also have a cousin who belongs to Alcoholics Anonymous. My father has epilepsy and my mother has syphilis, so neither of them can work. They are totally dependent upon my two sisters who are prostitutes in Stettler. And said the reason they're prostitutes is because my only brother is serving a life term in prison for rape and murder and he can't help. I'm in love with a streetwalker who operates near our base. She knows nothing of my background but says that she loves me. We intend to get married as soon as she settles her bigamy case, which is now in court. When I get out of the Navy, we intend to move to Detroit and open up a small house. Now, my problem is this. In view of the fact that I intend to make this girl my wife and bring her into my family, should I or should I not tell her about my cousin who is in AA? If we're going to talk about the big book, which of course we are this weekend, the entire weekend until the time we leave Sunday, I think we could probably all maybe understand the book better, and we would be able to see the perfect sequence that the book is written in if we would go back and talk just a little bit about some of the information that lies behind the writing of the big book in the first place. If we talk just a little bit about how the big book got to be here and why it came about that it was written for us back in 1939. And I think in order to look at that information, probably the best place to go would be into the big book itself. So we're going to go to the foreword to the second edition. If you guys are ready, we'll open up the book and we'll start. And we'll go to Roman numeral 15, last paragraph, and begin to look at a few of the ideas behind the book itself.
In this paragraph we look at, we see a little bit of the history of Alcoholics Anonymous and the beginnings and some of Bill's experiences. And throughout this portion of the book, and a number of times this weekend, we'll mention this several times because we're going to see where Bill found out about the problem, he's going to find out what the solution is, and then he's going to find out the program of action. And that is very, very paramount to this book because this book is written in that sort of a sequence to find out what the problem is, the solution, and the program of action. So on the forward of the second edition, it says the spark that was to flare into the first AA group was struck at Akron, Ohio in June 1935 during a talk between a New York stockbroker and an Akron physician.
Now we know those two fellows to be, of course, the New York stockbroker is Bill Wilson. The Akron physician is Dr. Bob Smith. I think we're treating old Bill pretty good when we call him a New York City stockbroker. He really wasn't. He was a New York City stock speculator. He made his living by selling fast-talking to slow-thinking people. He was a real con artist. I don't want to take anything away from Bill. He's a great man, but I think if we can all fully understand and accept the fact that Bill was a real alcoholic, really wasn't a hell of a lot different than any of the rest of us, it'll make it a lot easier to understand how he writes as he writes the book. And there's no doubt at all that Bill was a real alcoholic, and he really was a stock speculator rather than a stockbroker. And of course, Dr. Bob was the Akron physician who lived there in Akron, Ohio.
6 months earlier, the broker had been relieved of his drink obsession by a sudden spiritual experience following a meeting with an alcoholic friend who had been in contact with the Oxford groups of that day.
Now, a little later on, when we get into Bill's story, we'll be able to see where Bill had what he always referred to as a vital spiritual experience and recovered from alcoholism. But in order for him to do that, he had to have certain pieces of information. And the spiritual experience came about in the town's hospital after the old friend, who's a guy named Ebby Thatcher, had come to visit with Bill. And during that visit with Bill, Ebby told Bill two things. He told Bill about the need for a power greater than human power. He said, for people like us who become absolutely powerless over alcohol, if we're to recover, we're going to have a power not only greater than we are, but a power greater than human power. All the human powers, the doctors, the ministers, the psychiatrists, those have all failed, and apparently the power will have to be a power greater than human power. And he said, I've been going to a group of people that told me if I could have a vital spiritual experience, that I would be able to find that power. And that power would be strong enough to overcome the power of alcohol. And he said also, these people, I call them the Oxford groupers, a group of people practicing first century Christianity, have given me a practical program of action. And he said they guaranteed me if I would apply that program of action, I would have the vital spiritual experience, I would find the power greater than human power, and I would be able to recover from alcoholism. And he said, Bill, I've been with that group of people for 2 months. I've applied that program of action. I've had a spiritual experience, and I haven't had a drink in 2 months. So Ebby, the old school friend, the old drinking buddy of Bill's, brought him 2 valuable pieces of information. He brought them what we call the solution to alcoholism, which is the vital spiritual experience. And he brought to him a practical program of action which, if applied in his life, would bring about the vital spiritual experience. So from Ebby, Bill learned the solution to alcoholism. He also learned the program of action necessary to bring about that solution.
He'd also been greatly helped by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, a New York specialist in alcoholism, who is now accounted no less than a medical saint by AA members, and whose story of the early days of our society appears in the next pages. From this doctor, the broker had learned the grave nature of alcoholism.
We'll also be able to see in Bill's story where a couple of years before, he talked for a year and a half at least before Ebby came to see him, Bill had gone into the town's hospital in the summer of 1933. And there Dr. Silkworth had withdrawn Bill from alcohol, got him in pretty good shape physically and mentally, and he sat down with Bill and explained to him the ideas that he had regarding alcoholism. And he told Bill, he said, I don't believe this thing is a lack of willpower like so many people say. I don't believe it's moral character, and I don't think sin has anything to do with it. He said, Bill, I believe it's an actual illness. And he said, people like you have become powerless over alcohol really due to 2 things. He said, I believe that you have developed an actual physical allergy to alcohol. And whenever you take a drink, it produces a physical craving in your system, which is so strong it overcomes the ability of your mind to stop you after you once start drinking. He said, also, I think people like you have developed an obsession of the mind. An obsession of the mind being an idea that overcomes all ideas to the contrary. And he said, Bill, it really doesn't make any difference how badly you want to stay sober or how badly you need to stay sober. From time to time, the obsession of the mind is going to be so strong that it'll make you believe something that isn't true. And he said, you'll believe that it's okay to take a drink. And based on believing the lie that it's okay to take a drink, you'll take the drink and you'll put it in your system, and then the physical allergy will take over, and then you'll end up drunk and sick and in all kinds of trouble. He said, people like you can't drink safely because of the physical allergy of the body, and you can't stay sober because of the obsession of the mind. And he said, if you can't drink and you can't stay sober, then you've become absolutely powerless over alcohol. So Bill learned the problem of alcoholism from Dr. Silkworth long before Ebby ever came to see him. We'll also be able to see in Bill's story that he tried to stay sober based upon that knowledge of what alcoholism is to no avail whatsoever. It's only when Ebby came to see him and brought him the solution, and then Bill began to apply the solution, that he had the spiritual experience and he recovered. So Bill was the first one of us to really know through all 3 things. What is the problem? What is the solution? And what is the practical program of action necessary to find that solution?
And Ebby began to take Bill to the Oxford group meetings. He said, though he could not accept all the tenets of the Oxford groups, he was convinced of the need for moral inventory, confession of personality defects, restitution to those harmed, helpfulness to others, and the necessity of belief in and the dependence upon God. And those are the 6 tenets of the Oxford group, which later was to become and expanded into the 10 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, steps 3 through 12. And prior to his journey to Akron, the broker had worked hard with many alcoholics on the theory that only an alcoholic could help an alcoholic, but he succeeded only in keeping sober himself.
As soon as Bill had that vital spiritual experience in the town's hospital, a part of the program of action coming out of the Oxford groups was, if you're going to keep it, you got to give it away. And Bill immediately began to try to work with other alcoholics there in New York City. None of them, though, had responded. Probably Bill tried the same thing that all of us did. Almost immediately when we come to AA, we take step 1, go immediately to step 12. And Bill seemed to do the same thing. He started trying to give this away, probably jerking people off the bar stools, seining them up out of the gutters, trying to cram this thing down their throat. None had responded, period. And one day while back in the town's hospital in New York City, he was there to visit with and talk with another drunk that Dr. Silkworth was withdrawing from alcohol. Bill ran into the doctor and he said, "Doctor, I must be doing something wrong. I'm trying to give to other people what has been given to me, but nobody seems to want what I have to offer." And Dr. Silkworth said, "Well, Bill, you're probably trying to cram that great white flash, that spiritual experience you had up here in the hospital, down their throat." And he said, "You don't cram anything down the throat of an alcoholic. He'll just puke it right back up every time." He said, "Why don't you tell them what I told you?" He said, "Every alcoholic that I know has 2 questions. 1, why can't I drink like I used to without ending up drunk and sick and in trouble? 2, why can't I quit now that I want to?" He said, "Explain to them the physical allergy. Explain to them the mental obsession of the mind. Explain to them the hopeless condition of the body and of the mind, and when you do, you'll get their attention. Then after you get their attention, then you can talk to them about spirituality." But he said, first tell them what's wrong with you. Now, we don't think it's by accident that the very next alcoholic Bill talked to happened to be Dr. Bob in Akron, Ohio. Joe?
The broker had gone to Akron on a business venture which had collapsed, leaving him greatly in fear that he might start drinking again. He suddenly realized that in order to save himself, he must carry his message to another alcoholic.
We've all heard and know the story about Bill going to Akron on one of his business ventures. He and a group of people were involved in a proxy fight to take over one of the companies there in Akron. Now, this is in the midst of the Depression. Nobody has a dime, but that really doesn't make any difference. Bill's still going to get to be the president of this company. And while there, the partners deserted him. The takeover fell through. Bill standing in the lobby of the Mayflower Hotel, counting the money that he had in his pocket with one hand, and realized he didn't have enough to pay the hotel bill or anything else. He felt very low, very sad, and very depressed. He looked through a door off of the lobby into the bar at the hotel, and probably like most bars, I imagine the lights were low. Probably the smoke was thick. I would assume that the music was playing and the laughter was great. And Bill's mind says, I believe I'll go in there and have a soda, and I'll be with people of my kind, and I'll feel better. But as he started through the door for the first time, his mind said, Bill, you can't do that. If you go in there, you're going to end up getting drunk just sure as anything. Now, Bill remembered how back in New York City, even though he had never helped another alcoholic, that every time he had tried to help another alcoholic, he himself had felt better. So in desperation, Bill made a few phone calls, finally came in contact with Henrietta Seiberling, who got him in contact with Dr. Bob. Now, Bill went to visit with Dr. Bob, not to sober up Dr. Bob, but to keep Bill Wilson himself from getting drunk. Joe?
So the physician had repeatedly tried spiritual means to resolve his alcoholic dilemma, but had failed. Dr. Bob was going to the Oxford groups in Akron. Henrietta Seiberling was going to the Oxford groups in Akron. In fact, they'd talked to Dr. Bob many times about spiritual means, a way of him to get over his drinking. In fact, they had the group that they were going to prayed that Dr. Bob might find a solution to his problem. So when Bill calls up on the phone in the middle of the night, they felt that this was the answer that they'd been praying for. So that was how Bill was able to get into the cyberlinear state to talk to Dr. Bob. They were expecting a miracle, and here was one that called up on the phone. But when the broker gave him Dr. Silkworth's description of alcoholism and his hopelessness, the physician to begin to pursue the spiritual remedy for his malady with a willingness he had never before been able to muster. He sobered never to drink again up to the moment of his death in 1950.
Now, this is one of the first, I think, great miracles of Alcoholics Anonymous. Here was this conning New York City speculator, sits down with a well-trained physician and explained to the physician what was wrong with his body and what was wrong with his mind. Normally, the physician would have said, "Who in the hell are you to be telling me what's wrong with my body and my mind?" But the message that Bill carried, which came from Dr. Silkworth, had such depth and such interest that Dr. Bob bought into it immediately, began to apply the program of action in his life, and he also recovered from alcoholism through a vital spiritual experience. Now, this is in the summer of 1935, and we now have two men in Akron, Ohio, both of them knowing three things. Both of them knowing what the problem is, what the solution is, what the practical program of action is. Both of them had applied the program of action, and both of them had recovered from alcoholism.
Now, this seemed to prove that one alcoholic could affect another as no alcoholic could, as no non-alcoholic could. It also indicated that strenuous work, one alcoholic with another, was vital to permanent recovery. Hence, the two men set to work almost frantically upon alcoholics arriving in the ward of the Akron City Hospital. Their very first case, a desperate one, recovered immediately and became AA number 3.
Now, we see this guy's picture, or a picture that represents this, in AA rooms all over the world. We call it the man on the bed. And here we see Bill and Bob sitting at the side of the bed with a guy named Bill Dotson. And they sat down and they told Bill Dotson three things. They told him what his problem is, they told him what the solution is, and they told him the practical program of action. 2 days later, Bill Dotson said to his wife, "Get my clothes out of the closet, I'm going home." He got up, he dressed, and he went home. He applied the program of action in his life. He had a vital spiritual experience, and he recovered never to drink again up to the moment of his death also. So now then, we're in the summer of 1935, and we got three people that all three know three things. What's the problem? What's the solution? What's the practical program of action? All three had applied the program of action. All three had recovered from alcoholism.
This work at Akron continued through the summer of 1935. There were many failures, but there was also an occasional heartening success.
Now, I think sometimes we need to put our minds back into that era of time and realize that in 1935, these guys really had no idea what they were doing. Everything they were doing was strictly by trial and error method. You know, one of Dr. Bob's favorite things was to fill them up with kraut juice. For some reason, he felt that kraut juice would do something physically that would make it a lot easier for them to stay sober. And it says there were many, many failures. You know, and every once in a while, one of these guys would fall over dead. And I can almost see Bill say to Dr. Bob, "Oh shit, let's don't do that again," you know. I think sometimes we need to go back and give credit to those they fail with, as well as give credit to that first 100 for putting this thing together. Because many of the people they worked with and experimented with that summer of 1935, they did fail with, and several of them did die from alcoholism. But every once in a while, one of them would get sober.
Even today in AA, I don't know who to thank the most, those that stay sober or some of those that don't. Kind of cold, but everybody has something to teach me. When the broker returned to New York in the fall of 1935, the first AA group had actually been formed, though no one realized it at the time. By late 1937, the number of members having substantial sobriety time behind them was sufficient to convince the membership that a new light had entered the dark world of the alcoholic. A second small group had promptly taken shape at New York, and besides, there were scattered alcoholics who'd picked up the basic ideas in Akron or New York and were trying to form AA groups in other cities. Now, there was not any AA at that time. These people who were going to these Oxford group meetings, they were known as the alcoholic squad of the Oxford group meetings. No AA yet. And the people in the Oxford group didn't necessarily like those alcoholic squad because they seemed like they told a lot of raunchy jokes, and they smoked cigarettes galore, and they drank a lot of coffee, and generally just messy. And they weren't particularly interested or really cared that much for the alcoholic squad. They kind of tolerated them, I think, at that time. Still no AA, just an alcoholic squad that was going to the Oxford group meetings.
Now, in the summer of 1937, Bill was back in Akron again on a business trip. Didn't come to see Dr. Bob, but while there, he decided to go by and visit with Dr. Bob and see how things were going. And they sat down there in Dr. Bob's home in Akron, and they counted the number of people that they knew were staying sober on these 3 little pieces of information. And to their amazement, they realized approximately 40 people were staying sober. Some in New York City, some in Akron, and some in various other different places. And I think maybe for the first time they begin to realize that maybe we have found the answer to this thing called alcoholism. And immediately they were faced with a decision on what are we going to do about it. You know, they could have said, well, hell, there's 40 of us and that's enough. We don't need anybody else. Now, they could have said that we'll keep this thing for our own selfish purposes and we won't share it with other people. But I think maybe this is the first instance of the group conscience beginning to work, because they decided they didn't want to make that decision themselves. And they called a meeting of those there in Akron, and at that meeting that night there was approximately 19 people. And these 19 people sat down and made a decision on what to do with this information. The first thing they decided they would do would be to build a chain of hospitals stretching all the way across the United States and Canada, so any alcoholic anywhere could have medical treatment if necessary. Surely that must have come from Dr. Bob. The second thing they decided to do was to hire and train a group of missionaries. And these missionaries would fan out all the way across the United States, Canada, and eventually the world, and carry this great message of recovery to every alcoholic wherever they might be. Bill was going to be the head missionary.
Real alcoholic.
Now, the third thing that they had to decide is, how are you going to get the money to pay for the hospitals and the training of the missionaries? We're in the Depression now. Nobody has any money, period. So they said, well, what we really need to do is take this information we have and put it down in the written form, basically for 2 reasons. Number one is, surely it will bring in a lot of money. You know, back in the 1930s, books were very popular. This was long before the days of television. And believe me, there was a time before television. Many of you don't know about it, but I do. I remember that time. And most people read a lot of books. And they felt if they could write a book on alcoholism, telling people what alcoholism is and how to recover from it, that the book would immediately become one of the world's best sellers, and they would make literally hundreds of thousands of dollars from the book. Then that money would finance the hospitals and the treatment centers. Well, thank God only one of those 3 things came true. They did write the book, but unfortunately for them and fortunately for us, the book didn't make any money because people didn't buy it like they thought they would. So therefore they didn't get to build the hospitals, they didn't get to hire the missionaries, but they did produce the book. The other thing the book was to be for was to take this information that they had gathered, that they had been transmitting to each other by word of mouth, and put it down in some comprehensive form so that people would be able to read it and study it and follow it and be able to recover from alcoholism also. Now they told Bill, we want you to write the book. But they said, as you write the book, we want to see what you write, and we'll review each chapter, and we'll add to, we'll delete from, we'll change around whatever's necessary, and we're through with it. It'll be the collective knowledge and experience of all 40 of us. Well, we know that by 1939 that turned out to be 100 instead of 40. Another reason behind the book, they had already noticed that by carrying it word of mouth one to the other, the information was already beginning to change. You know how people are, especially we alcoholics. We'll hear something good, and we can hardly wait to transmit it to somebody else. But in the transmission, we think of a few things to add to it that makes it a little better. And then the next one transmits it and adds a little more. And the next one transmitted, and by the time it gets back to you, it really doesn't resemble what started out to be the truth in the first place. And they could see that the information they had was already being changed, becoming garbled, and would eventually be useless. And they said, if we can get this down in the written form, then we can keep it as a permanent thing, and it will remain the same. So for 2 or 3 reasons, they wrote the book and put it together, starting really the decision made in the summer of 1937. Bill really didn't begin to write, though, until 1938, and of course finished it in 1939.
It was now time the Southern groups thought to place their message and unique experience before the world. This determination bore fruit in the spring of 1939 by the publication of this volume.
Now, this book that I have in front of me is one of the original, not the first printing. This is 11th printing, but it's one of the first edition books. And if you'll notice on it, it has a very bright colored dust jacket, all red and yellow and white and some black on it. They call this the circus jacket. I could almost see some guy in New York City or Akron walking down the street with this under his arm trying to remain anonymous. I don't think it would work very good. But the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world ever saw was this book titled Alcoholics Anonymous. Now, in this book was the story of how the first 100 men and women had recovered from alcoholism. And this book carried their program of recovery. So the first Alcoholics Anonymous that the world ever saw, which is a book called Alcoholics Anonymous, which contains a program of recovery that the first 100 people used in order to recover from alcoholism.
The reason they call it the Big Book, because the original first printing of the Big Book was a big red book. It was a thick book. They used real cheap paper in that book, which is thicker than thin paper. And they made it the same number of pages as we have now, except it made it thick and big, and they called it the Big Book. You know, you get more you pay a little more money for something bigger. And that was the thinking behind making this book big and thick, so that people would buy it. That's why they call it the Big Book. The membership had reached about 100 men and women. The fledgling society, which had been nameless now, began to be called Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. You know, in those early days, the people who wrote the book, the information and the program that they were working, the program that they were practicing, was the problem, the solution, and the planned program of action of the Oxford groups. This was the message that they were carrying to each other. And then they wrote this book, and they didn't have the title for this book, and they met one night to determine the title and the name of this book. And one of the ideas they come up with that was to call it the Way Out. And they determined that that title had been used before by a number of people. They were going to call it the Bill W. movement. His ego got involved, and he wanted to call it the Bill W. book. There was a number of things that they tried to call it. But some fellow that was there that night said, well, we're alcoholics, and we're anonymous. Why don't we call the book Alcoholics Anonymous, or Anonymous Alcoholics? And someone said, how about Alcoholics Anonymous? They said, yeah, that'll be good. We'll call the book Alcoholics Anonymous. So the first book the first words of Alcoholics Anonymous that the world had ever known was the book called Alcoholics Anonymous. There was still no AA at this time. There's just this drunk squad of the Oxford group. So they called this book Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's the first AA or Alcoholics Anonymous the world has ever known. The second thing they did, the people who began to go to these Oxford group meetings began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of its own book. So we had 2 different AAs. We had the book called Alcoholics Anonymous, and then we had the fellowship, that's us, who was called Alcoholics Anonymous. And the program in the book called Alcoholics Anonymous has never changed since the early times. It has never changed. But the fellowship has changed over the years. People come and go. You know, I used to say I came to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I didn't come to the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. I came to the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And thank God there were some people in the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous who led me to the program in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is in this book called Alcoholics Anonymous. So we have two AAs, the program that's in the book and the program that's in the fellowship. And we know in the fellowship people come and go. So this weekend, we're not going to talk about the program that's in the fellowship. We're going to talk about the program that's in the book called Alcoholics Anonymous.
This fledgling society, which had been nameless in 1939, now began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous from the title of the book. So in 1939, these two Alcoholics Anonymouses both had the same program. The program in the book was the same as the program in the fellowship, naturally, because those in the fellowship wrote the book. But as time went by and this book began to go out and fan out across the country, alcoholics began to receive a copy of it, read it, understand it, and do what it said, and begin to get sober and stay sober and start AA groups. And the fellowship began to grow from, really, the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. But as the fellowship began to grow and began to get bigger and bigger and bigger, some people began to say, now, look, I really don't like to do those things that they tell us we have to do in the book. Do we really have to do a fourth step the way it says to do that? Do we really have to make amends to other people? And some of them began to find or search for an easier, softer way. And next thing you know, the program in the fellowship began to change. And over a period of time, it changed to the point where today, in many, many cases, the program in the fellowship doesn't resemble the program in the book at all. You know, you go to a lot of AA meetings today, and I'll swear, if they didn't read the preamble before the meeting, you wouldn't know what kind of meeting you're in. They talk about everything except alcoholism and recovery therefrom. They talk about chemical dependency. They talk about sexual dysfunction. They talk about significant others. They talk about meaningful relationships. They talk about what their therapist had to say. They talk about come to 90 meetings in 90 days and you'll be all right. They talk about you can treat this as a cafeteria, take what you want and leave what you want. And as they begin to do these things, the program and the fellowship begin to change entirely. Now, as that program began to change, then the value of the program began to change also. When the program and the fellowship and the program and the book were the same, the recovery rate was very, very high compared to what it is today. In fact, let's go look and see what the recovery rate used to be when the two programs were exactly the same. Joe?
Roman numeral page 19, the last line, the beginning. He says, while the internal difficulties of our adolescent period were being ironed out, the public acceptance of AA grew by leaps and bounds. For this, there were two principal reasons: large number of recoveries in reunited homes. These made their impressions everywhere. Of alcoholics who came to AA and really tried, 50% got sober at once and remained that way. 25% sobered up after some relapses, and among the remainder, those who stayed on with AA showed improvement. Other thousands came to a few AA meetings and first decided they didn't want the program, but great numbers of these, about 2 out of 3, began to return as time passed. That's 75% ultimately. I wonder if we can brag about 5% today of the people who come to Alcoholics Anonymous. I think in my area, I know that there for a while, a few years ago, the fellowship got so far away from the program that lots of people came, but they didn't stay. But today in my town, the town that I go to AA in, most every group in town studies this book in some manner, and people are staying sober everywhere. It is unreal what's going on because the people are telling the new people about the problem and the solution and the planned program of action that's in this book, and people are staying sober everywhere, and it's really great.
Naturally, as they begin to practice a different program than what's in the book, then the recovery rate began to go down. And over a period of years, it went from this 75% down to 50, and then down to 25, and then down to 10, and probably today it really is 5% or less. And people come to AA today and they hang around for a few days. They go to 90 meetings in 90 days, and then they end up getting drunk and they say AA doesn't work for us. Well, the real problem is that they attended the fellowship only, did not apply the program of recovery, and naturally they ended up going back to drinking. Now today people say, well, you know, that's because of the quality of the newcomers that we're getting. You know, they come to us out of treatment centers and they don't know anything about AA, or they want to talk about everything except recovery, and we can't communicate with those people, and we're just going to stay home. And when we old-timers decide to do that, we abdicate our responsibility for AA, and we turn it over to the sickest of the sickest, who are the newcomers. And then when the group fails, we say, look what's happened to AA. I think the real responsibility for that lies within ourselves. The newcomer knows only what they know, and wherever they learned it and what they've learned is really beside the point. I think our job is to take each newcomer and explain to them that there is a difference between the fellowship and the program. Explain to them that all the things they learned wherever they came from are probably important, but they really don't have anything to do with AA. And explain to them that the program of recovery is in the big book Alcoholics Anonymous. Then take them to the book and show them where it is, and then take them by the hand and walk with them as they go through the book. Now, they used to call that sponsorship, and we really don't have a hell of a lot of that today. And I think if we could take each newcomer and be sure they know this information, then I think we could see that recovery rate start to change. Instead of treating it as a social club, I think people would start to treat it as a recovery club and begin to use the program and begin to recover from alcoholism. And I think we could see that rate go back up, maybe not to 75%, but surely a lot better than what we're doing today. Now, we're not going to preach anymore all weekend.
You don't believe that, do you?
That's the last of the preaching we do. From here on out, it's not going to be very serious. Joe?
Okay. All right, now we go back to the table of contents. You know, I happen to be in the printing business personally. And when I first started reading this book on my own, I didn't have much instruction with it. But I started reading this book, and I didn't realize that this book was written in a certain sequence to bring about certain ideas. Had no idea, because I thought it was a book written by a bunch of alcoholics, and they were erratic as hell, and they wouldn't know how to write a book that had any common sense to it or any rhyme or reason. But I have found out since studying this book and looking at the table of contents that Bill knew exactly what he was doing. He wrote this book in the same manner in which he received the program of alcoholics, which was to be called Alcoholics Anonymous. He first talks about the problem, then he tells us what the solution is, and then he tells us a planned program of action. And that's the way this book is written out. And the whole story and the whole first 164 pages is described in this manner.
We call it the Big Book Goals. And we're going to see as we go through the book if we can't find these same three pieces of information that Bill and Bob had to know, that all of the first 100 had to know in order to recover. And the first thing we're going to try to find out is what is the problem. You know, you really can't do much about a problem until you understand what the problem really is. I was sitting up in the room today thinking about that, and we had a big rainstorm here this afternoon. And if you happen to be home in your living room when the rain came, and you saw water dripping out of the ceiling, well, on the surface of things, you would think that your problem is that you got a leaking roof. But that really isn't your problem. Your problem is, where does that sucker leak? You know, it could be leaking through a shingle. It could be leaking in a gutter. It could be leaking around some flashing. Many different places it could leak. The first thing you're going to have to find out is where does it leak in order to decide what you're going to do about it. And the problem of alcoholism is exactly the same. In order for an alcoholic to recover, he really needs to understand what the problem is. And alcoholism is a funny kind of illness. It's one of the few illnesses in the world today that tells the person who suffers it that he doesn't have it. You know, that's how you find out who's got alcoholism. You ask them, And if they say, I might have it, don't worry, they're not alcoholic. The alcoholic doesn't know that he's got it, and his illness tells him that he doesn't have it. Therefore, it's very difficult for the alcoholic in order to determine what the problem is. It's also one of the few illnesses in the world today where the person who suffers it is the one that has to make his own diagnosis. So it's very, very difficult for the alcoholic to understand what the problem really is. The doctor's opinion in Bill's story, some of it in chapter 2 and 3, but most of it in the doctor's opinion in Bill's story, will tell us what the problem really is. And the problem boils down to a problem statement. Our real problem is that we are powerless over alcohol. So therefore, to describe that condition, we use step 1. Step 1 is a problem statement. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And we'll see that information in a doctor's opinion and Bill's story, basically, in order to find out what the problem really is. Now, if the problem is powerless, then surely the answer to it's going to be power. And we'll find as we go through the book, they can do nothing about the physical allergy. So the only hope for us to recover is to do something about the obsession of the mind. Therefore, our recovery is going to be based upon a power greater than we are, working through the mind. All recovery has to come through the mind. And we're going to find in chapters 2, 3, and 4 all the information necessary for us to come to the conclusion that we are that there is a power greater than we are that can restore us to sanity. And that's really what step 2 is. Step 2 talks about that power, and it's also a statement or a conclusion drawn in the mind. Now, if we're able to see where we're powerless, and if we're able to see that the answer to that is power working through the mind, then we only need one more thing. How do you find that power? And we'll find that chapters 5, 6, and 7 lay out a practical program of action, steps 3 through 11. And if we practice those programs, we will find the power in order to overcome the powerless condition in step 1. So the last goal will be the action necessary for recovery, which really boils down to 3 through 11, then 12, having had a spiritual experience as the result of this course of action, is what the book originally said. So we'll see that the big book is divided up into the 3 sections, just the same as Bill and Bob and the first 100 had to know them. What is the problem, what is the solution, and what's the program of action? And if we bear that in mind as we go through the book, we'll be able to see where each chapter falls in place just exactly where it should to give us certain information to base these ideas on. Joe?
See, each chapter that we read and understand leads us to the next chapter and the next chapter, and then we start the steps, and each one of those steps is a result of the first doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. Because in the doctor's opinion, the first 4 chapters is step 1 and 2. There's no way to take steps 1 and 2. These are conclusions that we learn as a result of the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters. You know, one of the things that we did as a fellowship is we took the steps out of the book and we put them on these little cards and on the wall. And I think they look lovely on the little cards and on the wall. I like to use them that way. The only thing that we didn't do is we left the instructions on how to work the steps in the book. We just took the steps off the wall, and people began to come into AA and taking the steps off the wall without any instructions. And that's kind of hard to do. Okay, on Roman numeral page 11, the preface. A little bit of information there on that second paragraph that Charlie and I find to be extremely important, at least it was for me. It says, because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left untouched in the course of revisions made for the second and the third editions. The section called The Doctor's Opinion was kept intact just as it was originally written in 1939 by the late Dr. William D. Silkworth, our society's great medical benefactor.
I think there's two ideas within that paragraph. First, because this book has become the basic text for our society. I think when we see the words basic text, we're alerted to the type book we have in front of us. You know, there's all kinds of books in the world today. We have novels. We have novels written on fact and novels written on fiction. We have biographies, autobiographies, and we could name many, many different kinds of books. We also have books that are called textbooks. And many of us have formed an aversion to the very idea of a textbook. Because we remember how back in school we had to use those things. We had to read and study from them when we'd really rather be doing something else. We had to take tests on the information within them, which might cause failure. And many of us formed an aversion to the very idea of a textbook.
See, when I see the word textbook, I think about cheat. For some reason, I don't know why.
But if we will take a textbook in its simplest form, it is nothing more than a tool that is used to transfer information from the mind of one human being through the written word to the mind of another human being, thereby increasing the knowledge of the user of the book. And really, that's all teaching is. And one of the favorite sayings in AA today is, well, you can't teach in AA. Well, I don't know why we can't. Because teaching is nothing more than transference of information from one mind to another. We all teach every day in one form or another. We're all taught every day in one form or another. That's how we learn things, and that's how we transfer knowledge from ourselves to another person. And that's all in the world a textbook is. A textbook usually assumes that the reader of the book will know very little about the subject matter, and it nearly always starts at a simple level. Then as the knowledge of the reader increases, the information presented becomes more difficult. For instance, let's take a textbook on mathematics. And let's say my friend Joe here knows nothing at all about mathematics. He can't add, he can't subtract, he can't do any of those things. Now, he can count. He can count to 21 if he's standing there naked and got everything where it's supposed to be. He could count to 21.
That's 20 and a half, actually.
And I walk up to Joe and I say, Joe, I've got a textbook on mathematics. I want you to go to chapter 5 and work the problems dealing with algebra. Well, being a good fellow, Joe will go look at the algebra problems in chapter 5, but hell, he can't even add and subtract. It just looks like a bunch of scratches on paper to him. But if I say, Joe, chapter 1 deals with the value of numbers and addition and subtraction, and if you'll read it and study it and ask questions as you need to, whenever you're through with chapter 1, you'll know what to add and subtract. And sure enough, he does that. And then I say, now chapter 2 deals with multiplication and division. Based on what you learned in 1, you can now go learn how to multiply and divide in 2, and he does that. And then we take him to 3, where we deal with fractions and decimals, and we gradually prepare his mind to be able to learn the new information in chapter 5. I think one of the greatest mistakes being made in AA today is a newcomer comes in the door, we hand them the big book, we say go to chapter 5 and do what it says, and you'll be okay. And they go to chapter 5 and they read how it works, and immediately they run into a bunch of algebra problems. Step 1 said we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, our lives had become unmanageable. The newcomer says, I'm not powerless over anything. I have no idea what we mean by that statement. Step 2 said we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, and they say, don't tell me I'm crazy. Oh yeah, I do stupid things when I'm drinking, but when I'm sober, I'm like other people. They have no idea what we mean by that statement. Well, if you're not powerless and you're not nuts, then you don't need step 3 to turn your will and your life over to the care of something you don't understand in the first place. And we present them with an impossible situation. If we can show nothing else all weekend, I hope it will be the idea that the doctor's opinion in the first 4 chapters are put in there and in a certain sequence to present information to us in that sequence to prepare our minds for what we're going to have to do when we get to chapter 5. You know, chapter 5 really starts with step 3. It doesn't start with 1 and 2. It starts with step 3, which assumes that we already have taken steps 1 and 2. I think the other thing that is so important is there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. This thing has worked so good for so many people. We simply refuse to make any changes in it. Now, most of us, being good alcoholics, have surely rewritten this thing in our mind 2 or 3 times. But collectively, so far, we've never found it necessary to change the first 164 pages in the big book, which deals with recovery from alcoholism. Why haven't we found it necessary to change it? Very simple. It works just as good today as it did in 1939. Alcoholics don't change. You know, they're doing the same things today they did in 39. They're getting drunk. They're getting in car wrecks. They're getting in hospitals. They're getting in divorce courts. They're getting killed. They go to penitentiaries just like they did in 1939. Alcohol doesn't change. It's the same thing today as it was in 39. The bottles are different. The cans have got flip tops on them instead of bottles with caps on them. But the stuff that's in it is exactly the same as it was in 1939. Human nature doesn't change. It's been the same for thousands and thousands of years. So if alcohol doesn't change, the alcoholic doesn't change, human nature doesn't change, then surely the program of recovery doesn't need to change either. It works just the same today as it did in 1939. A few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago to be exact, some people began to think we needed to change the book. They wanted to change this and change that and change other things. So our General Service Office put out a survey and surveyed the fellowship to see what, if anything, they wanted to change. And the overwhelming answer was, don't change anything. Leave it alone, just like it's always been. I think that's the second great miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous, that we haven't changed this thing in over 50 years. I think it's important we realize that, and that we know that we're reading the same book today that they read in 1939. There's been 3 editions of it, but the only changes are the stories in the back of the book. They've been changed to more accurately reflect the changing makeup of the fellowship. Originally, it was nearly all men, most of them reasonably old. As time went by, age began to come up, age began to go down, bottom began to come up. More and more women came into the fellowship, so they changed stories in the back of the book. But the recovery program is still the same.
You know, I called my sponsor one time, this talking about changing about my program, and I said, Franklin, my program has gone to hell in a handbag. I said, I'm mad at everybody. I'm mad at Phyllis. I'm mad at the people I work with. I'm mad at the people in AA, and my program's just not working at all. And he said, Joe, your program's working just fine. As a matter of fact, your program's doing exactly what it was designed to do. He said, why don't you try working the program? Now, there's a lot of difference between my program and the program, believe me. Forward to the first edition. Some other information in here that I find very, very interesting to me. Roman numeral page 13.
We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. 2 little ideas. First, we're more than 100 men and women. Most books that I read have been authored by one person. And with my keen intellectual alcoholic mind, if I read a book authored by one person and I find something I disagree with, I usually say, who in the hell is he to think he knows more than I do? And I just ignore it. But if I do that with a big book, I'm not going to argue with one. I'm going to be arguing with 100. Started out 40, told Bill to write it. But remember, they also said, Bill, this is not to be your book, it's our book. And as you write it, we want to see the chapters, and we'll add to, delete from, and change around whatever's necessary when we're through with it. it'll be the collective knowledge, experience, and wisdom of all 40 of us. Well, by 1939, that 40 had changed to 100. So if I read the book today and argue with it, I'm not arguing with one person, I'm arguing with 100 people who have recovered from the same thing that's killing me as a practicing alcoholic, a seemingly hopeless condition of the mind and of the body. It's a little hard to argue with 100 than it would be with one. The other idea is to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. Now, Joe and I have both been around AA long enough to know and fully agree that there's only one requirement for membership in AA, and that's a desire to stop drinking. You can't make anybody do anything in AA. The only thing they got to have is a desire to stop drinking. You know, you can come to an AA meeting and say, I don't like you people at all. Every time I read your 12 steps, I almost vomit, and I can just barely drink your lousy old coffee. And nobody can say a thing about that. You don't even have to be sober to be a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. It helps if you are, but you really don't have to be sober to be a member. But that's all dealing with membership and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. This book doesn't deal with that at all. This book deals with one thing and one thing only: recovery from a hopeless condition of the mind and of the body. And the purpose of this book is to show other alcoholics precisely how the first 100 recovered. Then if we want to follow their precise program, I expect we could get the same thing they got: recovery from that hopeless condition of the mind and of the body. Later on, the book will use such words as specific. Later on, it will use such words as clear-cut directions. This book does not deal with generalities. It deals with precise, specific, clear-cut ideas. Joe?
It says that we have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. It's already beginning to tell us more about what the problem is. It's a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And about 4 or 5 lines down, it says, many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. When I came into Alcoholics Anonymous, I had no idea that I was a very sick person. I thought I was a no-good, rotten SOB. That's the way I felt. And for 2 or 3 years, all I did was stand in the back of the room, look down at the floor, because I was ashamed to look at people. I had no idea that I was a very sick person. I thought I was a no-good, rotten SOB because that's what my wife called me. My wives call me. I've been married, divorced to 2 women 7 times, trying to break me from drinking.
What?
Yes. Married, divorced to 2 women 7 times. They were all trying to break me from drinking. Never did work any, but they tried.
Every time I hear him say that, it just blows my mind. Married and divorced to 2 women 7 times.
You know
Real
why?
alcoholic.
Yeah. You know why divorces are so expensive? Well, they're worth it. No, I'm just kidding. But I had absolutely no idea that I was a sick person. I thought I was a no-good, rotten SOB, and that's the way I felt. It wasn't until I began to learn some information about the illness of alcoholism that changed the way that I thought and the way that I felt about this thing that I had. I knew I was an alcoholic, but I thought I was a sinful, rotten, no-good, hateful, angry person, which is what I had become. But I didn't know that I was sick. And it's extremely important for me to know that I was a sick person trying to get well in Alcoholics Anonymous rather than a bad person trying to get good. Because between those 2 ideas is a world of difference and ignorance and misunderstanding on my part. And I needed the information that we're going to talk about here in the doctor's opinion. Just briefly on the forward to the 3rd edition, the last paragraph. It says, in spite of the great increase in the size and span of this fellowship, at its core it remains simple and personal. Each day, somewhere in the world, recovery begins when one alcoholic talks with another alcoholic, sharing experience, strength, and hope. And I think that's extremely important information. It was for me. And I see a lot of new people coming to us today in buses from our area, from treatment facilities. And I'm glad to have them, very glad to have them. But when they get there, they gang up in one spot and they don't visit with the people in the meetings. You know, Alcoholics Anonymous is one-on-one. It was one-on-one then. It's one-on-one now. And I'm going to have a lot of questions that I need to ask somebody That's questions that I don't have answers to, questions that I'm going to have as a result of studying this book, then I need somebody in Alcoholics Anonymous who has this information, who can help me. And that's called a friend or a sponsor in Alcoholics Anonymous. I need to find somebody that I can trust or try to trust so they can help me to answer those questions, because I'm going to need to know precisely and exactly how to recover from alcoholism. And I need somebody that I can do that. AA was one-on-one then, it's one-on-one now. And so if you're new here, find somebody in these rooms at your meetings that you can trust, who seems to be walking and living the way you want to, and ask them to be your sponsor to help you go through this book. You could say, save my life.
Okay, now prior to 1930, 29, 30, 31, 32, the world knew really very little about alcoholism. And almost all the misinformation, almost all of the ignorance regarding alcoholism, and nearly all of the ideas that were wrong came from people who are non-alcoholics. Now, the non-alcoholics are the ones who said it must be weak willpower. Those who could drink successfully, or those who didn't drink at all, would look at the alcoholic and watch them and say they must have weak will. Well, today we know that absolutely is not true. Alcoholics are amongst the most strong-willed people in the world. You know, weak-willed people don't become alcoholic. Hell, the third time they vomit, they just quit drinking. The alcoholic knows there's got to be some way to drink without puking. We damn near kill ourselves trying to learn how to do that. People who are non-alcoholic are the ones that said, well, he must be a sinful person. And they're the ones that said it must be a lack of moral character. The alcoholic never said any of those things, period. In fact, most of we alcoholics really didn't care. Hell, we just kept right on drinking. We wasn't concerned with what it is. And it's only in the 1930s that we really begin to get some ideas about what alcoholism really is. And alcoholism is not anything new. Alcoholism has been with the human race as far back as the furthest recorded history that we have. In fact, we'll find references to the drunkard or to the alcoholic in the Bible. One of the most learned people that we know, as far as history is concerned, was a fellow named Solomon. You know, Solomon was the guy that had the answers to everything. And people who had a problem usually came to Solomon to get the solution or to get the answer to it. And apparently somebody one day asked Solomon about the one who drinks too much. And Solomon wrote some information, put it in a book that I call the Big Book, the Bible. And in Proverbs in the Bible, which Solomon is accredited with writing, let me read you what he had to say thousands of years ago about this thing called alcoholism.
That's Proverbs 23 through 29, if you're interested.
He said, who hath woe, who hath sorrow, who hath contentions, who hath babbling, who hath wounds without cause, who hath redness of eyes, they that tarry long at the wine. Now, in those days, everybody was a wino. They didn't have distilled spirits then. He said, they are those that go to seek mixed wine. He said, look not upon the wine when it's red, when it giveth its color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. He said, because at the last it shall biteth like a serpent, and stingeth like an adder. Now surely he knew some of us fellows quite well. He said, thine eyes shall behold strange women, and thine heart will utter perverse things.
Yeah. Trust me, honey.
He said, yea, thou shalt be as one who lieth down in the midst of a sea. You know, you lay down on that bed and that thing starts swaying around and going. Or one who lieth at the top of a tall mast. You know how the mast of a ship will sway back and forth. And he said, you shall say, they have stricken me, and I felt it not. You know, how many times have we wakened up the morning after bruises all over our body. Wonder how in the hell they got there. He says, we shall say they have beaten me, and I didn't feel it at all. Yet when I awake, I will seek it yet again. Perfect description of the alcoholic. Just as valid then as it is today. Wisdom is a lasting thing. You know, wisdom never changes. Now, down through the years, various people tried to decipher and figure out what alcoholism is. There was a doctor named Dr. Benjamin Trotter, some 300 years ago in England, that said he felt that alcoholism was a disease process of some kind. But that's about all he could ever say for it. Then in our country, in the States, a little over 200 years ago, there was a psychiatrist named Dr. Benjamin Rush. In fact, he was one of the signers of our Declaration of Independence. He wrote a paper, an entire paper, on this thing called alcoholism. Let me read you just a couple of paragraphs of what Dr. Rush had to say about alcoholism over 200 years ago. He said, the effect of ardent spirits divide themselves into such as are of a prompt and also a chronic nature. The former discover themselves in drunkenness, and the latter in a numerous train of diseases and vices of the body and mind. He said, I shall begin by briefly describing their prompt or immediate effects in a fit of drunkenness. This odious disease, for by that name it should be called, appears with more or less of the following symptoms, and most commonly in the order of which I shall enumerate them. He said the first symptom will be unusual garrulity. You know, we love to talk whenever we're drinking. The second symptom will be unusual silence. Number 3 will be captiousness and a disposition to quarrel. Number 4 will be uncommon good humor and an insipid simpering or laugh. Number 5 will be profane swearing and cursing. Number 6 will be a disclosure of their own or other people's secrets. Number 7 will be a rude disposition to tell those persons in company whom they know their faults. Number 8, certain immodest actions. And I'm sorry to say this sign of the first stage of drunkenness sometimes appears in women who, when sober, are uniformly remarkable for chaste and decent manners. Number 9 will be a clipping of words. Number 10 will be fighting. A black eye or a swell nose often mark this grade of drunkenness. Number 11 will be certain extravagant acts which indicate a temporary fit of madness. These are singing, hallooing, roaring, imitating the noises of brute animals, jumping, tearing off clothes, dancing naked, breaking glasses and china, and dashing other articles of household furniture upon the ground or floor. After a while, the paroxysm of drunkenness is completely formed. The face now becomes flushed. The eyes project and are somewhat watery. Winking is less frequent than is natural. The underlip is protruded. The head inclines a little to one shoulder. The jaw falls. Belchings and hiccup take place. The limbs totter. The whole body staggers. The unfortunate subject of this history next falls on his seat. He looks around him with a vacant countenance and mutters inarticulate sounds to himself. He attempts to rise and walk. In this attempt he falls upon his side, from which he gradually turns upon his back. He now closes his eyes and falls into a profound sleep, frequently attended with snoring and profuse sweats, and sometimes with such a relaxation of the muscles which confine the bladder and the lower bowels as to produce a symptom which delicacy forbids me to mention. He quite often craps in his breeches is what he does. In this condition he often lies 10, 12, and 24 hours up to 2, 3, 4, or 5 days, an object of pity and disgust to his family and friends. His recovery from this fit of intoxication is marked with several appearances. He opens his eyes and closes them again. He gapes and stretches his limbs. He then coughs and pukes. His voice is hoarse. He rises with difficulty and staggers to a chair. His eyes resemble balls of fire. His hands tremble. He loathes the sight of food. He calls for a glass of spirits to compose his stomach. Now and then he emits a deep-fetched sigh or groan from a transient twinge of conscience, but he more frequently scolds and curses everything around him. And this state of languor and stupidity remains for 2 or 3 days before he's able to resume his former habits of business and conversation. I'd say that Dr. Rush knew us quite well over 200 years ago. So we always find these references. But it's only in the 1930s that a doctor came along and really began to identify alcoholism. And this little doctor is this fellow called Dr. Silkworth. And Dr. Silkworth was working in the Towns Hospital in New York City, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. You know, doctors really don't like to work with alcoholics. Invariably, they'll say that the reason they don't like to work with us is because we won't do what they tell us, which is absolutely true. They say we'll tell lies to them, which is absolutely true. But the real reason they don't like to work with us is down in the States we don't pay their bills anyhow, so they don't want a hell of a lot to do with us. Dr. Silkworth went to the Towns Hospital in 1930 because he had lost everything that he had during the big stock market crash of 1929. He had to have a job. And he went to work in this little hospital in New York City called the Towns Hospital, $40 a week, room and board, working with alcoholics and cocaine addicts of all things. And he began to become interested in the alcoholic. He would see them come in, physically a total wreck, mentally all screwed up. He would withdraw them from alcohol. He would begin to give them the proper vitamins and the proper food and the proper things to build their physical condition up. They would stay there 30, 60, 90 days. They would leave there with their mind fairly straightened out, their body in good shape, and the next time he would see them would be when they came back in that same condition. He didn't see them recover from alcoholism. He saw them go out and drink and come back and go out and drink and come back and go out and drink and come back until eventually they would die from alcoholism. And he began to develop the idea that there must be some kind of power in the body and the mind of the alcoholic